to my third point. Gertrude likes me. Encourage her a little and she will tell you so." Felix's tongue obviously moved much faster than the imagination of his auditors. His eloquence, like the rocking of a boat in a deep, smooth lake, made long eddies of silence; and he seemed to be pleading and chattering still, with his brightly eager smile, his uplifted eyebrows, his expressive mouth, after he had ceased speaking, and while, with his glance quickly turning from the father to the daughter, he sat waiting for the effect of his appeal. "It is not your want of means," said Mr. Wentworth, after a period of severe reticence. "Now it's delightful of you to say that! Only don't say it's my want of character. Because I have a character, I assure you I have. A small one, a little slip of a thing, but still something tangible." "Ought you not to tell Felix that it is Mr. Brand, father?" Charlotte asked with infinite mildness. "It is not only Mr. Brand," Mr. Wentworth solemnly declared; and he looked at his knee for a long time. "It is difficult to explain," he said. He wished, evidently, to be very just. "It rests on moral grounds, as Mr. Brand says. It is the question whether it is the best thing for Gertrude." "What is better? What is better, dear uncle?" Felix rejoined urgently, rising in his urgency and standing before Mr. Wentworth. His uncle had been looking at his knee, but when Felix moved he transferred his gaze to the handle of the door which faced him. "It is usually a fairly good thing for a girl to marry the man she loves!" cried Felix. While he spoke, Mr. Wentworth saw the handle of the door begin to turn. The door opened and remained slightly ajar, until Felix had delivered himself of the cheerful axiom just quoted. Then it opened altogether, and Gertrude stood there. She looked excited; there was a spark in her sweet, dull eyes. She came in slowly, but with an air of resolution, and, closing the door softly, looked round at the three persons present. Felix went to her with tender gallantry, holding out his hand, and Charlotte made a place for her on the sofa. But Gertrude put her hands behind her and made no motion to sit down. "We are talking of you," said Felix. "I know it," she answered. "That's why I came." And she fastened her eyes on her father, who returned her gaze very fixedly. In his own cold blue eyes there was a kind of pleading, reasoning light. "It is better you should be present," said Mr. Wentworth. "We are discussing your future." "Why discuss it?" asked Gertrude. "Leave it to me." "That is, to me!" cried Felix. "I leave it, in the last resort, to a greater wisdom than ours," said the old man. Felix rubbed his forehead gently. "But en attendant, the last resort, your father lacks confidence," he said to Gertrude. "Haven't you confidence in Felix?" Gertrude was frowning. There was something about her that her father and Charlotte had never seen. Charlotte got up and came to her, as if to put her arm round her, but suddenly she seemed afraid to touch her. Mr. Wentworth, however, was not afraid. "I have had more confidence in Felix than in you," he said. "Yes, you have never had confidence in me, never, never. I don't know why." "Oh, sister, sister!" murmured Charlotte. "You have always needed advice," Mr. Wentworth declared. "You have had a difficult temperament." "Why do you call it difficult? It might have been easy if you had allowed it. You wouldn't let me be natural. I don't know what you wanted to make of me. Mr. Brand was the worst." Charlotte at last took hold of her sister. She laid her two hands upon Gertrude's arm. "He cares so much for you," she almost whispered. Gertrude looked at her intently an instant, then kissed her. "No, he does not," she said. "I have never seen you so passionate," observed Mr. Wentworth, with an air of indignation mitigated by high principles. "I am sorry if I offend you," said Gertrude. "You offend me, but I don't think you are sorry." "Yes, father, she is sorry," said Charlotte. "I would even go further, dear uncle," Felix interposed. "I would question whether she really offends you. How can she offend you?" To this Mr. Wentworth made no immediate answer. Then, in a moment, "She has not profited as we hoped." "Profited? Ah, voilà!" Felix exclaimed. Gertrude was very pale. She stood looking down. "I have told Felix I would go away with him," she presently said. "Ah, you have said some admirable things!" cried the young man. "Go away, sister?" asked Charlotte. "Away, to some strange country." "That is to frighten you," said Felix, smiling at Charlotte. "What do you call it?" asked Gertrude, turning an instant to Felix. "To Bohemia." "Do you propose to dispense with preliminaries?" asked Mr. Wentworth, getting up. "Dear uncle, vous plaisantez!" cried Felix. "It seems to me that these are preliminaries." Gertrude turned to her father. "I have profited," she said. "You wanted to form my character. Well, my character is formed, for my age. I know what I want. I have chosen. I am determined to marry this gentleman." "You had better consent, sir," said Felix very gently. "Yes, sir, you had better consent," added a very different voice. Charlotte gave a little jump, and the others turned to the direction from which it had come. It was the voice of Mr. Brand, who had stepped through the long window which stood open to the piazza. He stood patting his forehead with his pocket-handkerchief. He was very much flushed. His face wore a singular expression. "Yes, sir, you had better consent," Mr. Brand repeated, coming forward. "I know what Miss Gertrude means." "My dear friend," murmured Felix, laying his hand caressingly on the young minister's arm. Mr. Brand looked at him, then at Mr. Wentworth, lastly at Gertrude. He did not look at Charlotte. But Charlotte's earnest eyes were fastened to his own countenance. They were asking an immense question of it. The answer to this question could not come all at once, but some of the elements of it were there. It was one of the elements of it that Mr. Brand was very red, that he held his head very high, that he had a bright, excited eye and an air of embarrassed boldness. The air of a man who has taken a resolve, in the execution of which he apprehends the failure, not of his moral, but of his personal resources. Charlotte thought he looked very grand. And it is incontestable that Mr. Brand felt very grand. This, in fact, was the grandest moment of his life, and it was natural that such a moment should contain opportunities of awkwardness for a large, stout, modest young man. "Come in, sir," said Mr. Wentworth, with an angular wave of his hand. "It is very proper that you should be present." "I know what you are talking about," Mr. Brand rejoined. "I heard what your nephew said." "And he heard what you said!" exclaimed Felix, patting him again on the arm. "I am not sure that I understood," said Mr. Wentworth, who had angularity in his voice as well as in his gestures. Gertrude had been looking hard at her former suitor. She had been puzzled, like her sister, but her imagination moved more quickly than Charlotte's. "Mr. Brand asked you to let Felix take me away," she said to her father. The young minister gave her a strange look. "It is not because I don't want to see you any more," he declared, in a tone intended, as it were, for publicity. "I shouldn't think you would want to see me any more," Gertrude answered gently. Mr. Wentworth stood staring. "Isn't this rather a change, sir?" he inquired. "Yes, sir." And Mr. Brand looked anywhere, only still not at Charlotte. "Yes, sir," he repeated, and he held his handkerchief a few moments to his lips. "Where are our moral grounds?" demanded Mr. Wentworth, who had always thought Mr. Brand would be just the thing for a younger daughter with a peculiar temperament. "It is sometimes very moral to change, you know," suggested Felix. Charlotte had